how disposed of. Which pains me, I have to say.
Welcome to WatchMojoUK, and today we're counting down our picks for the most awkward and uncomfortable reveals on Who Do You Think You Are? We're looking at moments that are both awkward for the celebrities and perhaps also awkward for the viewers at home, being presented with some uncomfortable truths about British history.
Didn't expect this at all.
Before we begin, we publish new content every day, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos.
Number 10. Squatting complaint.
Apparently that however remembered that he was squatting and they'll have to be quiet and they have to blow out the candle and make sure they stay in the dark.
EastEnders star Rose Ayling-Ellis found out that her family history is closer to the fictional soap than first assumed. She found out that her family were pub landlords in days gone by, and that one of her ancestors was once fined for assault after drunkenly slapping a customer.
The vent was very drunk and he came up to him and slapped him in the face.
Later though, she investigated an old family story that they'd once been squatting and found out that it wasn't true.
But they're not squatting because they rented.
You're right, they were paying rent.
They were, in fact, paying tenants, but somebody made a complaint against them, which led to them trying to be as quiet and non-disruptive as possible. The source of the complaint? Kids accidentally throwing a ball over the neighbouring workhouse's wall while playing. They were actually evicted because of this.
Requirement on the neighbour have failed to prove any evidence of disturbance. Indeed, the evidence available goes to show that the wealthy family are in bed at 10 o'clock at night.
Number 9. Con artist.
At Westminster Police Court, W. Morris Crouch, otherwise Morris Beethoven, late of Ebury Street, Pimlico, was brought up in custody. Oh my God.
Fiona Bruce had a photographer in her family history, but he seemed to lose an awful lot of money, and she wanted to find out where it was going. So she started investigating William Crouch, her great-great-grandfather, by going through photography journals. But it turned out he was a criminal and had been arrested for defrauding people. He'd been asking potential photography apprentices to pay him large deposits, keeping the money for himself.
The prisoner entered into agreements undertaking to make repayment of the deposits, but at the time his affairs were at the lowest pecuniary ebb.
He was caught and ordered to pay, but the money was already gone. The evidence stacked up, and he ultimately pled guilty back in 1904, getting a 5-month sentence and causing a scandal.
Obligation, so that is why he took on so many pupils and assistants, to fleece them. The pupils had little or nothing to do. For some time, defendant had not a camera on his establishment.
Number 8. Family farms.
They were tenants, what we call tenants at will, so they didn't have a lease.
Throughout the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th, Ireland was in the grips of the Irish Land War, in which the Irish people demanded reform from the country's rich, landowning families.
At the time, the English Crown was seizing land from Irish Catholics and giving it to loyal English Protestant families, like the Palmers.
Julie Walters found out that some of her family, generations ago, were tenants under this system, living in a house owned by an English landlord, Roger Palmer. It's one of many dark chapters in British history and is a very striking moment when the historian shows the enormous manor house Palmer lived in, paid for by the unwilling tenants across Ireland.
The owners of the land were that privileged, wealthy minority.
Living off the backs of these poor people.
Her family, the Clarks, were also affected by failing crops and potato blights and ended up unable to pay their rent.
Just the thought of having 4 small children and also the land not being brilliant land.
Number 7. Gardening drama. Sir Bruce Forsyth went all the way to America after being contacted by a long-lost relative in the States. He finds out that his great-grandfather, Joseph Forsyth Johnson, worked on Prospect Park in Brooklyn, New York, in the 19th century.
8 trees were cut, 12 were marked for cutting, and it was made to seem as though, again, he was clear-cutting the park.
But he was ousted when the public decided that his attempts to cut down a few trees to rejuvenate the park were actually an attempt to raze it and cut down all the trees.
The park royal.
Royal.
And you see here the next sub-headline. Joseph Forsyth Johnson gone. So despite
He was forcibly removed by the park commissioner, trading barbs in newspapers with the park department while trying to demand that they give him a fair hearing. More shocking, Forsyth later finds out that Joseph may have been a bigamist.
He says that Commissioner Summers is only a mechanic and that some people cannot tell sticks from trees.
Number 6. Dodgy stockbroker.
And here in, I think 1862 is another reference to him dealing or brokering gold mining in Wales.
Some of Rupert Everett's relatives are shrouded in mystery, among them his great-great-grandfather Frederick. While searching archives in the British Library, Everett found that he'd been working as a stockbroker for various mining companies.
Investors were encouraged to direct their money into speculative schemes with little official oversight.
But perhaps those mining companies weren't as lucrative as people thought, because he was ultimately arrested for attempting to defraud people by selling them shares and then just pocketing the money, a scam as old as time.
Charge of fraud against a stockbroker. Yesterday, Mr. Frederick Everett, a stockbroker, again appeared before the Lord Mayor.
It's always unpleasant to find out that one of your ancestors may have been a criminal, though the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Frederick ultimately went bankrupt and died of TB. Number 5. The Lodger's Secret.
Oh, yes, there he is. James Arthur Edwards. And he's there with Mabel. And who's Frederick Ernest Nash, who's living there as well?
Leslie Manville traced her grandparents back to 1918 and found out that her grandfather had been living with a woman named Mabel and another man, Frederick Nash, who was their lodger. She finds out that Mabel and Frederick had an affair and a child, and her grandfather James moved out of the house, leaving them to it.
Father's name and surname is Frederick Ernest Nash, and the mother is Mabel Edwards. Oh my goodness.
James moved on from the marriage to Mabel with a woman named Harriet, Leslie's grandmother. It was all very dramatic and difficult to unravel, but seemed to boil down to how it was almost impossible for working class people to afford to get divorced at the time, so her grandparents weren't legally married.
So these couples who are cohabiting without getting divorced, without being able to marry each other, whilst it's not a norm, it's certainly not that unusual.
Number 4. Abandoned.
Your mother was with this family only for 1 month, for a very, very short period of time.
Like Leslie Manville, Lulu had an old family mystery she wanted to solve. Why was her mother, one of 7 children, given up to another family? And why was it only her?
I have to say I'm feeling very angry with my grandparents. Willy-nilly having babies all over the place.
It certainly is awkward to learn information that makes you angry at your grandparents, though, and that's what happened. Elizabeth was the 4th born child, and when only a few months old, she was given away willingly by her parents. Lulu found out that it was because they didn't have any money, and her grandfather was in and out of prison.
Child went to school yesterday for the first time and is very pleased with herself.
Elizabeth's birth parents initially failed to pay the first family to take her, and she found another, permanent home that thankfully took good care of her.
In a lot of respects, your mother has been a very, very fortunate child.
Yes, and that's what my uncle James said. She was lucky.
Number 3. Strikebreaking ancestor.
He's in the turret, chucking stones at them.
Something like that.
Pretty much.
Yes.
Jack Whitehall and his father Michael wanted to learn about their ancestor Thomas Jones Phillips, who was a solicitor involved in monitoring industrial disputes in Wales in the 1830s. Phillips was tailing the Chartists, who, among other things, wanted universal male suffrage, that is, the right for all men, regardless of class, to vote.
Oh, no. It is our ancestor Thomas Jones Phillips. He's the dodgy emissary that's come to the meeting in like a bad disguise.
It's not that surprising to find out that someone as posh as Jack Whitehall had dodgy ancestors, but discovering that Phillips disguised himself to spy on the Chartists and report back about their activities was deeply reprehensible.
They're forming mobs and they're heading down towards Newport, and our ancestor is trailing them in his first-class coach, monitoring them at every point.
He was also involved in trying to convict many Chartists after a lethal riot, all in exchange for a cash reward he claimed not to know about. Number 2. The Orange Order.
My father was
He was an orange man.
Oh, he was?
He was, eh?
David Tennant has always had strong connections to the church, with his father being a minister in the Church of Scotland. But he was completely unprepared to go to Northern Ireland and meet some distant Protestant relatives, discovering that one of them was in the Orange Order.
Was William in a lodge as well?
I don't know.
Right.
You could probably follow that through maybe through the Memorial Hall.
They told him this as he sat down for a cuppa and brought out an orange sash to show him, giving it to him to take to a nearby memorial hall and ask more questions about the relatives he didn't even know he had until recently. He talked to the camera crew about how disturbed he was to be given this information and handed the sash itself.
How did you feel when you were handed that sash?
Not great. Even now, I'm not that comfortable holding it.
Number 1. Slave-owning history.
This is shocking.
This episode made for very upsetting viewing, as TV chef Ainsley Harriott went to Jamaica to learn about his ancestor James Gordon Harriott. Nobody was prepared to learn that his family actually owned slaves in Jamaica at one point, and that his surname, Harriott, came from distant white ancestors.
So this was something that was passed down through the family, learning the skill and art
of purchasing your slaves.
Harriott and his family had previously assumed that they were descended from black slaves on Jamaica, so discovering this shook him to his core. It's very difficult information to come to terms with, as the historian pointed out how many slaves his family had once owned.
He owned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 slaves.
I can see that.
No, actually.
Let us know which celeb's family history surprised you the most.
One moment you're feeling this almost hatred for people who dominated and controlled and...
Do you agree with our picks? Check out this other recent clip from WatchMojoUK and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.